All right, so I'm going to try to cover everything about plants, but summarize a lot of different things about plants all at once. All right, and to kind of keep it as brief as possible um, while covering everything. And then I have separate individual lectures that go into much more detail on individual groups, life cycles, processes, anatomy, and all those other things if you're looking for more specific details. But this is going to kind of give you the huge overview summary of everything about plants. All right, so we said that early plants had to evolve um, for life on land. So they had problems like desiccation and gravity, among, I'm sure, many other things. Right? So how do they prevent drying out? Well, we said there was something called sporopollenin that can help protect the reproductive structures, spores, and pollen, which we'll talk a little bit about in these life cycles. And then gravity, as far as structure goes. So they had to like build something internally to protect themselves. In addition, the body of the organism itself, not just the pollen and spores, need to be protected against drying out. So for desiccation, we started to build up a waxy cuticle. So essentially, the body of the plant is covered like a waxy coating that prevents the water from getting out. Problem is that it also prevents gases, waste gases from getting out, and other gases from getting in. So plants then have to have little openings or little holes, right, in them that can allow gas exchange. So they have these little structures called stomata on the leaves, which are like these little holes. And then they have cells around them that can kind of open up and then kind of shut and then open. And then that way they can allow gas to actually move out of the plant and pull gas in, but then shut it to keep water from evaporating out of the plant. So plants will have that as an adaptation that's to living on land, that's also to their own cuticle that's protecting them from drying out. It's kind of a multiple step process. Gravity, they're going to have some more structural materials, and they're going to require ultimately to get larger some type of transport system to move fluids and all throughout the body of the plant. And so that's going to require some type of vascular system, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about. So the other thing we're going to look at is the groups of plants. So plants are a kingdom. Right? There are about 12 phyla. It's worth kind of going over some of these numbers just to give you a relative idea. Is it a big number? Is it a small number? That sort of thing. Again, classification is something that's always being updated. So again, we're focused more on the generalities and the big picture things that are probably never going to change, like the plants that produce spores. They're always going to produce them. So, and this is the name of that group, who they're related to, or how it might get reorganized. That kind of stuff might change. So the way the plants generically, this is not all 12 phyla, obviously, there's kind of 4 major groups, right? And so we have our Carophycean ancestor, right, to all of them, so the ancestor. And then we diversify into land plants. Right? We have a group called, referred to as the bryophytes. It's a group that contains the mosses. That's would be the ones that you're familiar with. There are other phyla within this group. They're all what are called non-vascular. So they don't have this vascular system, which means they have to stay really small. They also stay in really wet environments for a couple different reasons. This is a life cycle we're going to talk about for one of these members of this group, and it emphasizes a couple different important parts of the general life cycle of a plant. The pterophytes containing also a number of different phyla as well, but you're most familiar with the ferns. Okay, so ferns belong to the pterophytes. Now, they're not the only vascular plant. These are all vascular. Okay, so starting with the ferns. So bryophytes are not vascular. They have no transportation system for liquids and things within them, which I'm going to stop for a second now and actually talk about, right? Because we're saying they don't have a system, they have a system. What is this system that we're talking about? So there are really two major components: xylem and phloem. Two great words. Okay. So xylem are a series of tubes. Now, the thing is, one of the big things about the difference between them, the tubes themselves obviously are made of cells, but then the cells die, right? And then they just leave kind of like a straw-like tube. That's kind of then the xylem, that material, then allows water to be transported from roots up. So this is for water transport from roots. And it can go up then through the plant. So where's the pump? How does it get pumped up into them? It doesn't, all right? It's called capillary action. So when a tube, even now you can take a straw and just kind of put it into liquid, and what you'll find is that if this is the level of the liquid, you would expect it to be exactly the same, but it won't be. It'll actually typically be a little bit higher, right? Because of capillary action, because water molecules will attract to other water molecules, and they'll attract to other polar surfaces. And depending on the characteristics of the inside of this tube, they'll stick to the inside of the tube, right, as well. And they then almost like climb up a tiny bit up that tube. If that tube's diameter changed over a distance, if it keeps getting narrower and narrower over a distance, then this water level within the tube can raise up, right, much higher and kind of be pulled, right, through that tube based on the changing diameter of those tubes. So we call that capillary action, and so that can pull the water, right, through the plant. And so that's inside material that was live tissue that then made up all these tubes, and we refer to that as xylem. So the xylem moves the water. Now, in the plant leaves are where we see photosynthesis. As photosynthesis occurs, it's going to produce molecules, energy molecules, all right, taking light energy from the sun, converting into organic molecules. All right, they're going to take place, in all these leaves, and then that can be distributed because the roots aren't photosynthetic; they're not going to get that. The stem part isn't photosynthetic, so we're going to have to then transport things down to other structures. So say nutrients, some nutrients can be pulled up from the soil too. They could be minerals and things like that. But these are the minerals that are the things that are the products of photosynthesis. Okay, the sugar molecules and other things that are made by that process that can then get distributed throughout the plant. They're distributed through phloem. So the phloem is a series of tubes, but they're made up of live cells. So they're live cells that then can change a bit in shape, and then they move the material, so water and the dissolved products throughout the plant. So we kind of have the xylem and phloem are these two parts. They make little tubes, so it's called a vascular system. So a series of tubes running through a plant. The mosses don't have that. They don't have any of this. Okay, so they just kind of have to kind of take in, water just all throughout them. Exchange gases, do a variety of different things. The whole structure can be photosynthetic, and they kind of can just move by diffusion and other processes, cellular transport processes, to get their nutrients. As they get bigger, they require more kind of ways of moving things around, so that's why we can see ferns being much larger, say, than mosses, and then things like trees, like a pine tree, right, or a maple tree, or a variety of just different flowers and all that could be much larger and solid. They have to transport that material. So those are all the vascular plants. So bryophytes and pterophytes are mosses and ferns. Okay. Then we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. So the gymnosperms aren't all the conifers, but again, many of the conifers, right? Like pine trees, for example, firs, and those. Small needled and then cone bearing. There's other members again of this group, but these are kind of the most iconic that you're going to be familiar with. So the conifers are the example of the gymnosperms. Okay, so in addition now, these plants, in addition to being vascular, they're going to produce seeds. So the gymnosperms and angiosperms are going to produce seeds, both of them. And then so what's the difference is the gymnosperm, well, this is called a naked seed. It's not protected. All right, so the angiosperms have a protected seed. And in addition to that, the angiosperms produce flowers. Flower here is from just the angiosperm group. So we have flowers. Run out of space there, but so that's flowering plants. Okay, so that's just kind of a super general organization of all the members of the kingdom, right? And stepping through some of the major characteristics as we go through adaptation to land, multicellular, photosynthetic, all these characteristics, resistance to drying out, having a cuticle, then eventually gaining a vascular system, eventually producing seeds, and then producing flowers that can then help in the fertilization process, right? Angiosperms are the largest, most diverse group with the most species. So the flowers and the pollination process is really what allowed them to be so successful, in addition to all these other features. So all the ones that are vascular have xylem and phloem, and they move the nutrients and water through the plant. So looking at life cycles. So plants all have life cycles with two phases. All the plants are going to have these two phases of a life cycle. They're going to have a sporophyte plant and a gametophyte plant. It's called, so this and this both represent this, alternation of generation. They alternate between gametophyte and sporophyte plant forms. Those are just the terms. What does that mean? Okay, so we're going to start off here with a bryophyte or moss life cycle. That's what we're seeing in the middle. What we're looking at here, these structures kind of being released by this, which we'll come back around to, and down here are called spores. They have that sporopollenin protecting them. The spores are 1N haploid structures produced through, which process would produce that? Mitosis or meiosis. Produce 1N structures. Right? It'd be meiosis, right? So meiosis would have occurred to produce these spores. The spores go out, distribute into the environment, and then they just start to develop. So here we start to get a spore, say the spore starts to develop into some multicellular structure. That multicellular structure will give rise to the whole entire plant. All right, so our mosses, when you see a moss, that little green moss, if you look really close at the moss, you'll see like little tiny leafy structures and so forth, right? All of those cells, all of them, are haploid cells. Right? They are 1N. The whole organism is haploid. Right? You're often end up thinking that only things like sperm and egg are haploid, and everything else, the organism is all diploid, has doubled the number of chromosomes. But here's a whole organism, multicellular organism, can be somewhat large. I mean, they're not microscopic. They're big enough you can see them or hold them. And all the cells of the organism are haploid, having half the number of chromosomes as a product of meiosis without any fertilization taking place. It just develops directly into the multicellular plant. And that's what we have as a moss. So it's different, kind of unique. That's a phase of the life cycle, right? This is called, this phase here, and I'm gonna, since we're done talking about some of this, I'm gonna erase it actually, just so we have a little bit of space here. I won't erase all of it, maybe, because we might talk about it at some point. That's the gametophyte plant. It's macroscopic, you can see it, and so forth. Within the gametophyte plant, okay, structures are going to develop that will differentiate. And so some of these structures will produce sperm, and some will produce egg, right, or ova. Now, moss, which is kind of interesting, is a plant that has a swimming sperm. So I do a little sperm with a flagella, like a little flagellated protist. So a single cell, haploid cell, not produced through meiosis. The sperm is produced through mitosis, which again seems really weird. You're like, how the sperm is produced through mitosis, but the sperm is supposed to be 1N, right? Like for our genetics problems. Well, all the cells of the organism are 1N. So it's just dividing and then differentiating into a different type of cell, right? It doesn't have to undergo meiosis to do that. It's kind of different about this and unique, and that's why I'm spending extra time on it, because it's something unique and important here in the evolution of these organisms. The sperm it swims. So how is fertilization going to occur? Mosses need water for fertilization, right? Why do you only see mosses in wet environments? You don't see them in dry places because the sperm have to swim in order to get to an ova to undergo fertilization. Fertilization results in a 2N sporophyte plant. So we have two phases of the plant life cycle, the gametophyte and the sporophyte. The gametophyte is 1N, the sporophyte is 2N. Here, the gametophyte, right, is actually the dominant form. It's what we actually see as the plant. The sporophyte, you can see here I drew this little pink thing growing out. Relative to size, it's very small. So if this were the whole moss, the sporophyte would be, like this little thing sticking out of it. So the whole plant is really all 1N. It's this little pink structure I just drew here. That would be the 2N structure. So it's small by comparison. It doesn't exist all the time. It only exists after fertilization occurs. Then a structure forms here within the sporophyte that undergoes meiosis to produce spores. The spores, which are haploid, go out into the environment and then can spread and form more moss. So the sporophyte and the gametophyte actually fuse together as like one structure. They're not separate from one another, right? So they're actually the same organism, kind of with different phases, all kind of joined together. That's called our alternation of generations. And all plants have this to some degree. It just differs in kind of which phase is dominant and how certain things occur, right? So, but the core concept of this is what you really need to focus on. The details of all the different types of plants and all their different mechanisms is for a more advanced and different course. But you should have a basic understanding that plants all do this. Right? All trees, all things that produce flowers, all different things that grow vegetables, everything has something like this. Not exactly like this, because this is specific for mosses. Okay. So now we're going to talk about another different way, right, in which it happens. Okay. So that's the moss bryophyte cycle. I'm not going to go through every one again. I have other lectures that go through all the others. You can look at those if you want to get a different type of plant or group. The other version of this, okay, the dominant plant is the sporophyte. So the multicellular plant that you see. So if you look at a tree, That's a sporophyte plant. It's 2N. Right? If you see a tomato plant, it's going to produce tomato at the sporophyte plant. It's just flowers growing in the garden. Those are sporophyte plants. They're all 2N, the whole body of those. Right? So they all belong to the angiosperm group right up here. So their dominant form is the sporophyte. The gametophyte in them is going to be very, very tiny and typically microscopic. You won't actually ever be able to see it with your eye without looking through a microscope. So sporophyte plants who flower, we talked a little bit about this with genetics, right, on the Mendelian genetics part, right? They can be both male and female, right, at the same time. So they can produce the ova in the flower. So without going through all the flower anatomy, which I could go through separately, we have the female part producing the ova, the male part that can produce then pollen. All right, the pollen then has to be distributed, right? So one of the differences, say, between the gymnosperms and angiosperms here is that the pollen in the gymnosperms ends up being distributed mostly by wind. So often the pollen grains have little, almost like wing-like structures on them, so they can get taken and carried by the wind, and to find another female part to fertilize. So the pollen part is the male part here of this process, whereas the eggs or ova are the female part. Pollen in flowering plants can be distributed by pollinators, by animals. So flowering plants and the animals who feed on them and do pollination co-evolved right, at around the same time. So we see that in history. So bees are attracted to the flower. They feed off of sugary nectar that's produced here. They then pick up the pollen from these anthers. Then they fly around to another flower. As they feed off of this flower, they rub the pollen on the surface, right here, of the female structure. The pollen then starts to develop into a pollen tube. And inside that tube, I tried to draw it here before, these little guys here, would be then actual sperm. Differentiate and then swim down to allow fertilization to occur. Right, and so fertilization then occurs and forms a 2N embryo that will eventually become the new plant. At the same time, there could be more sperm coming down here to fertilize some of these other nuclei. They produce a structure that can be 3N called endosperm. So the endosperm is not a swimming little sperm structure, it's tissue. It's tissue that is nutrient tissue that helps the embryo develop, right? And then this whole structure gets coated by highly protective material and then forms the seed. Typically, this structure, this ovary, can then continue to develop into some type of fruit. So most fruits are actually the plant ovary. And then inside them then are the seeds, and that's for, well, the inside part of the seed is the nutrient part. The ovary part is for protection and dispersal. So then it's relying on some other animal to come along, eat the fruit, eat the seed. Seed doesn't get broken down, right, because it has a seed coat on it protecting it. And then the seeds are dropped by that organism someplace else, and then they can grow up and develop into new plants. Right? So when you're doing seed germination, there should be a seed coat protecting it. And then once water activates it, then the embryo can emerge from that seed and then start to grow. And so that embryo will result into 2N plant that at some point in time, once it matures, could produce flowers and then go through this whole life cycle. So the difference here is, part of this structure here would be the gametophyte plant, right, in here it's really microscopic and hard to see. It's nothing that you would really be looking at, but it's part of that reproductive life cycle. So, but for the ferns, the gametophyte plant is actually the main plant. It's actually the one that you actually see. For the others, it's the sporophyte plant, two-end plant that you see. And the gametophyte is usually very small. Ferns have a little more macroscopic version of the gametophyte. It looks like a little leaf. But again, it's very, very, very small. It's very hard to see in the environment, but it's sort of separate from the other part of the plant. So, that's really a bunch of the things about the plant. Now there's obviously a huge amount of plants you can cover. A plant course in botany can go all semester and still not cover everything about plants. This is just a super brief overview of some of the key things to take away from an overview of plants. Right? So they're all photosynthetic from a photosynthetic green algae ancestor. They diversify onto land. We have the mosses, the bryophytes, that undergo this life cycle here with a dominant gametophyte and then a very small sporophyte. So they produce spores through meiosis, but then the plant is formed through mitosis. The gametes are formed through mitosis, right? And that forms their life cycle. They are not vascular, so they do not have xylem and phloem. Then we have ferns that develop with xylem and phloem. They enter a similar but different life cycle where it shifts, and the sporophyte is the dominant form. They have the vascular tissues and become larger, right? But they don't produce seeds. Then you have the seed. They still produce spores, right, like this. So the ferns still produce spores. So these two are spore producers. And then gymnosperms and angiosperms are the seed producers. All right, we have here. Gymnosperms, cones, mostly naked seeds, don't have them protected by the ovary like this, and the pollen is different sorts of dispersal. The angiosperms then protect the seeds, right, with this endosperm and the seed coat, and their pollen has different mechanisms of distribution, so relying more on insects to do the distribution. And those are our flowering plants, which are the most really diverse and most abundant really group of plants. So that's a quick summary of some of the key things about the plant group and plant evolution.